Kieran Calloway wasn't used to being told no, especially not by a waitress in a cheap downtown diner with chipped coffee mugs and flickering lights. "Sir, I'm not going to serve you until you stop yelling at my staff," the waitress said, standing firm with her arms crossed and chin lifted. He blinked like someone had just slapped him. "Excuse me? You heard me." Her tone was calm but sharp, like a knife wrapped in velvet. "If you want coffee, you can ask like a decent human being. Otherwise, there's the door." The diner went quiet. A couple in the booth behind him stopped mid-bite. The other waitress froze near the coffee pot. And Kieran Calloway, the millionaire who owned half the buildings on this block, was left speechless, holding a crumpled napkin in one hand and his pride in the other. He hadn't meant to explode. It had been a long day. His CFO had just quit, and the company's latest investment pitch had tanked in front of international investors. He was running on 2 hours of sleep and caffeine. But none of that mattered now, not when a waitress with strawberry blonde hair and eyes like stormy skies had just humiliated him in front of 3 tables and a jukebox. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice lower now, curious more than angry. She looked him over unfazed. "Jessa. And no, I don't care who you are." He let out a breath, his jaw tightening. "You will." She rolled her eyes and walked off before he could say anything else. Kieran sat there, stunned.
No one had ever talked to him like that.
Not in years. Not since he became the Kieran Calloway, millionaire investor, tech genius, man who didn't even need to walk into meetings anymore because people came to him. But Jessa had looked right through him like he was just another guy with a bad attitude and a designer coat. He came back the next night, and the night after that. Every time, she served him with the same cool detachment, like he was any other customer.
No flirting. No fake smiles.
Just a tight ponytail, a faded name tag, and an occasional eye roll when he tried to charm her. "I'll have the turkey club again," he said on the 3rd night, flashing his usual confident grin. "You know there are other items on the menu, right?" she replied, scribbling on her pad. "I like the way you make it." "I don't make it." He leaned forward. "Then maybe I just like the way you serve it." She didn't answer, just walked away with that same calm speed that drove him insane. By the 5th night, he knew he was obsessed. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, though she was. It was the way she didn't care who he was. The way she didn't flinch when he tried to buy her attention. The way she spoke to everyone in the diner with the same respect and strength. She was unlike anyone he knew. Grounded. Honest. Unshakable. He needed to know what made her different. So he did what he did best. He made a plan. The next day, he made a few calls. Found out her last name was Jessa Arden. 26. No boyfriend. Worked double shifts. Rented a small 1-bedroom apartment uptown. Donated every Christmas to a local women's shelter. She was good. Too good for the games he usually played, which only made him more determined. "She broke my pride," he told his driver as they pulled up to the diner again. "So I'm going to break her walls. I'll make her fall in love with me." The driver didn't reply. Kieran didn't expect him to. That night, he brought flowers. Not roses. Jessa didn't seem like a rose girl. These were wildflowers, simple, messy, beautiful. She looked at them, then at him. "Is this supposed to change something?" "Maybe," he said, placing them on the counter gently. "Maybe I just wanted to apologize." Her expression softened a little. "For what?" "For being a jerk." She stared at him for a second. "Apology accepted," she said. "But I don't date customers." "I'll stop being one," he said immediately. "Let's go out. One dinner." She gave a small laugh, shaking her head. "Are you always this persistent?" "Only when I want something." Her eyes locked with his for a moment. Something shifted.
"Fine. One dinner," she said.
"But you're not buying me a $500 steak, okay?" He grinned.
"Deal."
They met at a small Italian bistro a few blocks away. Jessa showed up in jeans and a sweater, her hair down, lips bare of makeup. Kieran had never seen someone look so real and so beautiful. "You're staring," she said, sipping her water. "Can you blame me?" She laughed, but there was a flicker of nervousness in her eyes. "So, what's your deal, Kieran? You rich or something?" He leaned back, studying her. "Something like that." "How rich?" He hesitated. "I own Calloway Capital." Her brows shot up. "The one with the skyscraper on Fifth?"
Yeah.
She blinked. "You're serious?" "I am." "So, why are you hanging around a diner every night?" "Because you told me no." Jessa laughed again, the kind that made his chest ache. "You're insane." "Maybe. But I'm also right here. And I'm not going anywhere." They talked until the restaurant closed. About her dad, who left when she was 12. About his brother, who overdosed 4 years ago. About how she used to dream of moving to Paris and opening a bakery. About his fear that no one ever liked him for who he actually was. By the time they stepped outside, the air was cold and her fingers were wrapped in his. "I don't date customers," she said again, softly. "Then let me be more than that." He kissed her on the sidewalk, under a flickering streetlight, while taxis honked in the distance and the city moved around them. And for the first time in years, Kieran Calloway didn't feel like a millionaire. He felt like a man falling in love. And Jessa Arden, innocent, grounded, stubborn Jessa, was the only woman who'd ever made him want to stay there. The morning after their dinner, Kieran stood in front of the mirror in his penthouse bathroom, toothbrush hanging from the corner of his mouth, shirt unbuttoned, and a look on his face he didn't recognize. It wasn't confusion. It was something closer to disbelief. He'd spent years building an empire from concrete and code, but one night with a woman who didn't care about any of it had left him feeling like the ground beneath him had shifted. He walked into the office later than usual, ignoring the stack of investor reports waiting on his desk. The skyline outside his windows stretched out in sharp silver lines against the pale sky, but it all looked different today. Less invincible. "Mr. Calloway, the Tokyo call is waiting on line 2, his assistant called through the intercom. "Push it 2 hours, he said, already dialing another number. He didn't know what bothered him more, that Jessa had agreed to see him again, or that he couldn't stop thinking about what her fingers had felt like laced in his last night. She didn't answer when he called. Not the first time, not the second. By the third time, he left a message. "I'm not calling because I'm panicking. I'm calling because last night changed something. And I don't say that easily." He stared at the phone after hanging up, hating how raw his voice had sounded. He had meant to sound like that. Vulnerable. That night, he didn't go to the diner. He didn't want to look desperate. Instead, he drove to a bar near the financial district, met with a few venture partners, tried to pretend Jessa's silence didn't matter. It didn't work. The next evening, he found himself outside her apartment building, standing in the middle of cracked pavement and a rusted fence, holding a brown paper bag with 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and a bottle of apple cider. He rang the bell. No response. He rang again. The door creaked open. She stood there barefoot, wearing an oversized sweatshirt with a hole near the collar and her hair pulled back in a loose knot. Her expression wasn't angry. It was tired. "You're at my home now?" she asked, arms folded across her chest. "You didn't return my call." "I was thinking. I brought food." Jessa stared at the bag, then at him. "You're not used to waiting, are you?" "No," he admitted. "But I'll wait if it means you'll talk to me." She hesitated, then stepped back. 5 minutes, she said. "That's all you get." Inside, her apartment was small, lived in, the kind of place that smelled like cinnamon and laundry detergent. A photo of a little boy was taped to the fridge, and a chipped ceramic angel dangled from the curtain rod. "You have a kid?" he asked, pointing to the photo. "My nephew," she replied. "My sister's boy. I help out when I can." He placed the bag on the counter. "Is that why you work doubles?" "I don't want her drowning in bills. She's a nurse. One of the good ones." He slid the sandwiches onto 2 plates, then handed one to her silently. They sat on the couch, knees almost touching. "I didn't mean to chase you down," he said. "You're not exactly subtle." "I'm not good at subtle. Or patient.
Or
Whatever this is. It's not a game, Kieran. I know that. I'm not playing." She looked at him, really looked at him, like she was searching for something under all his polish and arrogance. "You're not used to people questioning your intentions. Because they usually don't."
Ido.
He set his sandwich down untouched. "Why did you agree to dinner in the first place?" "I wanted to see if you were real. And I don't know yet." That night, he didn't kiss her. He didn't ask her out again. He just cleaned up the plates, nodded once, and left. He didn't hear from her for 4 days. On the 5th morning, he found a note slid under his office door. "No envelope." Just his name in block letters. "You're not unbearable. I'll let you walk me home from work tomorrow. Don't be late." He arrived at the diner the next evening, wearing a jacket too expensive for the cracked sidewalk he waited on. She came out after her shift, hair damp from a storm that had rolled in suddenly, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "You're early," she said. "I thought you might change your mind." She didn't answer, just started walking. They moved side by side beneath the dark sky, passing shuttered shops and glowing signs. She didn't rush. Neither did he. "I knew who you were before you told me," she said, finally. He looked over at her. "I Googled you after your second night at the diner. Calloway Capital came up. So did the lawsuits, the headlines, the yacht photos." He said nothing. "I don't scare easy," she continued. "But I don't like being lied to."
Inevalit.
"You let me believe you were just some guy with a sharp mouth and a nice coat. I am. You're also a man who's been sued for wrongful termination and insider manipulation. That's what the media says."
I don't care about that.
"I care about who you are when no one's watching." He stopped walking. She did too. "I'm not proud of everything I've done," he said. "I've shut people out. I've made decisions for power. I've lost things that mattered." "Like what?" "My brother. My ability to trust. Any sense of peace." The rain started falling harder. She didn't move. "You think I can fix you?" she asked.
No.
"I think you already started." She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "I don't want to be another woman you use to feel better." "You won't be. I'm not here to heal you. I don't want healing. I want you." They stood there in the rain, not touching, not speaking, just breathing the same damp air. "I have one rule," she said, voice quiet. "Anything. You don't lie. Not once. Not even to protect me. I promise." "I mean it, Kieran." "So do I." She turned and kept walking. He followed. That night, he walked her all the way to her building. She didn't invite him in.
He didn't ask.
Instead, he handed her a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" "An invitation. I'm giving a speech at the Harvard Business Forum next week. I want you there." She raised an eyebrow. "And why would I go?" "Because I want you to see the world I live in. The version of me that built it. Not the headlines. Not the rumors. Just me." She folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket. "I'll think about it." He nodded once, then turned and walked away before he could say something he wasn't ready to explain. Back in his penthouse, he stood by the window, staring out at the skyline that used to feel like a crown. Now, it just looked like scaffolding. He wasn't sure what he was building anymore. But he was certain of one thing. Jessa Arden had become the blueprint he didn't know he needed. And every part of him, the broken, the proud, the terrified, was beginning to shape itself around her. The ballroom at the Harvard Business Forum gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, each one dripping light like falling glass. The air was thick with the scent of polished mahogany and expensive cologne, murmurs floating between tailored suits and structured gowns. Kieran stood at the edge of the stage, scanning the crowd as introductions were made. His name echoed through the speakers, but his focus was fixed not on the cameras, not on the investors, but on the last row by the far left pillar. She was there. Jessa. Wearing a navy coat buttoned high, her hands folded in her lap, hair pulled away from her face. No makeup. No pretense. Out of place and completely unmoved by it. He stepped up to the podium as applause followed. But he didn't hear it. His mind was still back in that diner, and then on that sidewalk, and then on her, always on her. Some of you expect me to talk about market shifts or the future of vertical technology, he began, gaze still anchored to her. But I'm going to talk about humility instead. That got their attention. I built my first company in a basement with less than $100. I sold it 3 years later for $10 million. I thought that meant I was untouchable. That power gave me character. But it didn't. It gave me insulation. And loneliness. A few heads tilted, confused. I thought I was building legacy, when really I was building armor. But recently, I met someone who doesn't care how many buildings have my name on them. Someone who looked me in the eye and saw straight through the walls I paid the world to respect. He didn't look at Jessa again, but he didn't need to. He felt her. Still as a tide waiting to turn. I've made mistakes. I've tried to buy redemption with performance. But the truth is, nothing real begins until you stop performing. Until you stop controlling how people see you. When he stepped down, the applause came slowly, then stronger. But he didn't wait for handshakes or photo ops. He left through a side hallway and waited by the east exit, under a flickering security light and the buzzing hum of a nearby vending machine. It took her 11 minutes to come. You didn't mention my name, she said, stopping a few feet away. I didn't have to. Jessa stepped closer, her coat damp from the drizzle outside. You surprised me in there. Is that good? I'm not sure yet. He exhaled. Come with me. I didn't bring anything. You won't need anything. They drove in silence. Out of the city, past the industrial corridors, into the hills where the air was colder and the stars returned. Kieran didn't explain. Neither did she. The house came into view slowly, a wide, modern structure tucked into the trees, all glass and quiet lines. He parked without a word and opened her door. You brought me to your secret lair? She asked.
No.
I brought you to the only place that ever felt like mine. Inside, there were no trophies. No art meant to impress. Just wide windows and worn wooden floors. A fireplace crackled in the far corner. The silence was heavy here, but not empty. My mother used to bring us here before everything fell apart, he said, tossing his keys into a bowl and walking into the living room. It's the only place I didn't ruin. She wandered in behind him, eyes taking in the space. You never talked about her before. She left when I was 16. Said she couldn't breathe in the house my father built. And your father? Died before I could forgive him. Jessa didn't ask anything else. She just sat on the couch and waited. Kieran stood facing the fire. You make me want to stop hiding. I'm not asking for that. I know. That's why it matters. The minutes passed slowly. Outside, wind rustled the trees. Inside, the only sound was the soft crackle of burning wood. Do you believe in fate? He asked suddenly. I believe in choice. I used to think I could choose everything.
Control everything.
But then I met you, and none of my rules worked anymore. Jessa rested her hands in her lap. Is that a bad thing?
No.
It's terrifying, but it's not bad. He turned around. I want to try something. With you. Something real. Not perfect. Not clean. Just real. Her expression didn't change. You're not used to asking for permission. I'm asking now. She stood slowly, walked to him, stopped inches from his chest. Then listen carefully, she said. I don't want to be rescued. I don't need your money. I don't need your apologies. I just need you to be consistent. I can do that. And if you ever lie to me, if you ever try to protect me, with silence I'll walk away. You won't have to. She didn't say anything else. Just leaned her head against his chest and let the quiet hold them. Later, they sat on the floor, backs against the couch, sipping tea he barely knew how to make. Her shoulder brushed his, and he didn't move. I almost didn't come tonight, she admitted. Why did you? Because something told me you wouldn't pretend. He looked over at her. I don't want to impress you. I want to know you. Then stop leading with your resume. He laughed, not the polished, rehearsed laugh people got in boardrooms. This one was rougher.
Real.
She glanced around. This place feels like it remembers things. It does. Then don't bring anyone else here. I haven't. I won't. They stayed in that house until dawn.
No promises. No declarations.
Just presence. Just air between them that didn't need to be filled with anything more. When the sun broke through the trees, she stood and stretched. I have work tonight. I'll drive you back. She turned to him. You're not going to show up at the diner again, are you?
No.
Good. But when she opened the front door, his voice followed her. Jessa. She looked back. I'm not trying to win you. I'm trying to deserve you. She didn't answer. But she didn't close the door either. That evening, he dropped her at her building. She kissed his cheek and left without looking back. And that was when he knew he was in deeper than anything money could fix or build or control. Because for the first time, he wasn't afraid of losing her. He was afraid of not becoming the man who could keep her. The next morning, his assistant placed a thick folder on his desk. The tax attorney flagged this, she said. It's about the foundation you donated to last quarter. There's a discrepancy.
Kieran opened it.
His breath caught. It was the same women's shelter Jessa had mentioned in passing. The one her sister sometimes volunteered with. His company had donated under a shell name months back, but the report showed that the funds hadn't reached the shelter. He stood abruptly. Get Elijah from compliance. And call the shelter director.
Now.
His assistant blinked. Right now.
Right now.
As she scrambled, Kieran stared out the window, expression hardening. Someone had funneled money away from a place that mattered to Jessa. A place that mattered to him now. And whoever had done it had no idea what they'd just touched. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was about to burn down whatever stood between her and the truth. The office was too cold. Kieran stood at the center of the glass conference room, eyes locked on the faces seated at the table. 12 executives. 1 compliance director. A legal advisor furiously flipping through documents. The silence between them felt like a fuse burning down. He dropped the folder onto the table. Whose signature is on that disbursement? Elijah, his compliance chief, cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. The initial transaction was authorized by finance. But the secondary transfer, it was redirected through a subcontractor we've used once before. It didn't raise any flags. It should have, Kieran snapped. We're not talking about a rounding error. We're talking about stolen funds meant for a domestic shelter. One of the board members leaned forward. Let's assume it was a clerical lapse. We can recover the amount and... No. Kieran cut him off. This wasn't a lapse. I want names. He turned to Elijah. Find out who approved the subcontractor. Find out who signed off on the transfer. And I want it today. When the room emptied, he stood alone, fists clenched at his sides. Not because money had been stolen, but because someone had touched something sacred without knowing it. The shelter wasn't just some tax-deductible line item. It was part of Jessa's world. And anything in her world suddenly mattered more than his own legacy ever had. By evening, Elijah returned with a name. Cameron Reese. He's in regional partnerships. Authorized the vendor and buried the redirect in a quarterly roll-up. Kieran didn't wait. He walked to the lower floor, past systems engineers and analysts, through doors that hadn't seen him in months. Cameron stood frozen at his desk when Kieran appeared. His face turned pale, mouth parting like he might lie. "You moved funds from Hopewell Shelter to your brother's shell company," Kieran said flatly. "Don't deny it. I was going to reverse it before the audit." "No, you weren't. I just needed some time. My brother, he's in debt, and I thought, you used a woman's shelter as a personal bank. You're fired. And if I find out even 1 cent went beyond what's in that report, I will make sure every door in finance is closed to you for the rest of your life." Cameron opened his mouth. "Get out." Security escorted him before he could protest again. Kieran stood in the hallway alone, the rage inside him quiet now. But something deeper had taken its place: resolve. This wasn't about cleaning house. This was about protecting something real, something that had nothing to do with profit margins or quarterly gains. Later that night, he stood at the edge of a crowded benefit gala, the kind he used to host without thinking. Everything shimmered: too much gowns, champagne, the laughter of people who didn't laugh with their eyes. He wasn't here for any of them. He was here for her. Jessa walked in wearing a simple black dress and a thin silver chain around her neck. She didn't scan the room. She didn't adjust her posture for anyone. She just moved through the crowd like she didn't owe it a single thing. She found him by the terrace doors. "You didn't mention this was a full-scale black tie event," she said. "You didn't ask. I'm surprised you wanted me here. I didn't want you to watch from the sidelines anymore." She glanced toward the main hall. "These people don't care about shelters or single moms or the women who sleep on bus stop benches every night." "I know. So, why host this?" "Because I'm about to change it." She turned to him fully.
How?
He took her hand and led her up the side stairs, onto the stage that overlooked the crowd. The music dimmed. People turned. Kieran stepped forward to the mic. "Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating innovation," he began. "But I've rewritten the agenda." A few chuckles. A few murmurs. He ignored them. "We had a breach at Calloway Capital. Funds were diverted from a shelter that serves women and children fleeing violence. That money was stolen, and I take full responsibility for not catching it sooner." He paused, eyes scanning the well-fed crowd. "And I'm giving back every cent personally, with triple restitution." Gasps rippled through the room. "But I'm not stopping there. Calloway Capital is launching a new foundation. It will fund permanent housing for survivors, scholarships for their children, and legal aid for their protection. This isn't a marketing stunt. There won't be any press releases. Those who want to partner can speak to me after. The rest of you enjoy the wine." He stepped back. The applause came slow, unsure, then stronger. But Kieran didn't care. He turned to Jessa, who was staring at him with something unreadable in her eyes. "You did this because of me," she said quietly as they stepped off stage.
No.
"I did this because I should have done it years ago, but you made me see what I refused to." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she whispered, "You're not who I thought you were." He stepped closer. "Then tell me who you see now." "I don't know yet." "Then I'll wait." They walked back into the crowd, but every time someone tried to approach him, he waved them off. He didn't need their praise. His eyes stayed on her, how she looked at the art without pretending to be impressed, how she thanked the waitstaff like they were the most important people in the room. She disappeared for a moment, and when he found her again, she was standing near the silent auction table, staring at a framed photograph of a cracked doorstep. He walked up behind her. "That's from Hopewell," she said. "The shelter entrance. It's where I dropped off my sister once. She didn't want me to see her cry." "She won't have to go back there again," he said. "I bought the building. I'm turning it into a permanent housing center. Under her name." Jessa's breath caught. "You're not supposed to do things like that." "I know." She looked up at him, and something shifted between them. Not softness. Not surrender.
Trust.
He drove her home that night, but she didn't get out of the car immediately. "I'm scared," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Of what?" "That I'll start depending on you." He turned to her fully. "Then let me earn it. Every day. No matter how long it takes." She didn't answer, but she leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. The next morning, Kieran stood in front of the downtown Calloway building and handed a press packet to the waiting reporters. He didn't give a speech. He just issued a single statement and walked away, leaving the headlines behind. Inside, his executive team stared at him as he entered the boardroom. "We're restructuring," he said. "Effective immediately." A few groans. Some confusion. He tossed a new org chart onto the table. "We're cutting bonuses, shifting profit margins, and reallocating funds toward long-term community equity. If you're here for the prestige, leave now. If you're here to build something that outlives our names, stay." No one moved.
Good.
That night, he found Jessa sitting on the steps outside her apartment. She looked up as he approached. "You're late," she said. "There was a boardroom mutiny." "I won." She tilted her head. "Why are you really here?" "Because I don't like sleeping in places where you're not." Silence stretched between them. Then she stood and opened the door.
Come in.
When he walked inside, he didn't see chipped paint or a sagging ceiling. He saw the only place that felt like a beginning. He didn't touch her that night. He didn't ask for anything. He just sat next to her on the couch, her legs curled under her, his shoulder against hers. And when she fell asleep on his arm, he didn't move. For the first time in years, Kieran Calloway didn't need to conquer anything. He just needed to stay. Kieran adjusted the knot of his tie in the mirror of his penthouse bedroom, but his hands were slower than usual, uncertain almost. The gala had stirred the press, and the boardroom restructuring had shaken more than a few egos. But it wasn't the business fallout that pulled at him. It was the way Jessa had rested her head on his shoulder that night. No words. No promises. Just trust. Quiet, tentative trust. And he'd felt it in his bones, the weight of it, the beauty of it, the responsibility of not breaking it. He checked his watch. He had 20 minutes before the meeting with the city housing commissioner. He'd arranged it quietly, without press, pushing for zoning approvals to begin construction on the new women's facility. But halfway through tying his second shoe, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. There was no greeting. Just a voice, low and sharp. "You're Kieran Calloway?" "Yes." "I thought you should know Jessa's sister collapsed at work. They brought her to Mercy General." The line went dead before he could ask anything else. He didn't hesitate. The meeting could wait. He was downstairs within minutes, calling his driver off and taking the wheel himself. Traffic blurred as he ran several red lights, the city's chaos pressing against the windshield. He parked illegally in front of the emergency entrance, ignoring the horn behind him and the security guard waving him off. Inside, the waiting room was buzzing, overcrowded, understaffed. He scanned the faces until he saw her. Jessa sat in a corner chair, her hands clenched together like she was holding something invisible in place. Her eyes were red, but dry. Her back was straight, her legs still. He walked toward her without a word. She looked up.
No surprise.
No relief. Just the flicker of something deeper, exhaustion wrapped in quiet dread. "They won't let me see her until she's stabilized," she said. "They said she collapsed in a stairwell." She hit her head. "Do they know what caused it?" "They're running tests. I think it's her heart." He sat beside her. Not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that his presence wouldn't feel like an afterthought. "I called in a cardiologist from Mount Eden," he said. "He'll be here in 20 minutes. Her head turned toward him. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She looked away again. "I didn't know who else to call," she whispered. "You didn't call me." Her voice was barely audible. "I didn't want to need you this soon." He didn't answer. He just reached down and took her hand, carefully. She didn't pull away. A nurse appeared 20 minutes later. Family for Mara Arden? Jessa stood so quickly the chair rocked behind her. She's stable, the nurse said. But we're admitting her for observation. There was an arrhythmia. We've started her on medication and we'll be monitoring closely. Can I see her? Only one visitor at a time. Keep it short. Jessa followed the nurse down the hall, and Kieran remained behind. But he wasn't still. He paced. He called his assistant, had her send flowers to the room, then called again and asked her to cancel the rest of his day. When Jessa returned nearly an hour later, her face was unreadable. She's awake, she said. But she's scared. She thinks she's going to lose her job. She won't. She's already missed 2 shifts this week. She won't lose it. You don't know that. I do, he said, because I just bought her employer. Her eyes snapped to him. I didn't plan to, he added. But the moment I knew she worked there, I made an offer. You can't fix everything with money. I'm not trying to fix it. I'm trying to protect it. They left the hospital a few hours later. Jessa insisted on taking a cab. He didn't fight her. He followed behind in silence, parking across the street from her building and waiting as she stepped out. She didn't look at him. But she didn't walk away either. I don't know how to do this, she said under her breath. This thing with you. I don't have room right now. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just here. That's the problem, she said, turning toward him. You're always here. And I'm starting to count on it. Then count on it. I don't want to get used to being rescued. You're not being rescued, he said. You're being loved. She froze. He hadn't meant to say it. Not like that. Not in a parking lot. Not after a hospital visit. But it was the truth. And she deserved the truth, even if it came out unpolished. I don't know what to do with that, she whispered. Then let it be enough for now. 1 week passed. Then 2. The days blurred between hospital rotations, Mara's recovery, and Kieran's tireless restructuring of Calloway Capital. But he didn't miss a single day. Every morning, he brought Jessa a coffee from the stand near the ER. Every evening, he waited outside until her sister was asleep. One night, she came out later than usual. Her shoulders were heavier, her steps slower. There's something else, she said. He didn't press. She's pregnant. He blinked. What? She's 2 months along. She didn't know. They found it during a scan. He stepped closer. How's the baby? So far, okay. But the doctors said the pregnancy puts more strain on her heart. She might have to stop working entirely. She didn't cry, but her voice frayed at the edges. I'll cover everything, he said. You can't just sweep in and save us. I'm not. I'm stepping in because I care. Deeply. She let out a brittle laugh. Do you even know how to care without taking over? No, he said. But I'm trying to learn. With you. She looked up at him, and something unspoken passed between them. A kind of surrender. Not romantic. Not soft. Just real. They stood there until the wind picked up and she shivered. He took off his coat and placed it around her shoulders. She didn't protest. Inside her apartment, she made tea. He didn't leave. You're not going to run, are you? She asked, hands wrapped around the mug. Not unless you tell me to. You keep stepping in like you're sure of everything. I'm not. I'm scared, too. Of what? I've never built something I couldn't control. But this he said carefully, this doesn't follow a blueprint. She sat on the couch, but didn't look at him. I think I'm falling for you. The words were quiet. Raw. He didn't answer right away. He sat beside her. Close. Still. I already fell, he said. I'm just waiting for you to catch me. She leaned her head back, eyes closed. What if I drop you? Then I'll get back up. And I'll try again. A long silence stretched between them. Then finally she whispered, Don't leave tonight. He didn't. He stayed, fully clothed, holding her until she fell asleep. Her breathing was slow, uneven, but steady. And he watched her like a man watching a future he never believed he could have. At dawn, he made a decision. He had built a company. Now he would build a life. One with her in it. Not by power, not by control, but by showing up. Every day, without fail. The way she had shown him it was possible. The wind whipped against the windows of the penthouse as Kieran stood with one hand braced against the glass, his reflection fractured by the city lights behind him. The skyline stretched wide and cold, but it no longer made him feel powerful. It felt distant now, impersonal, like something he'd conquered too early and no longer cared to touch. He should have been in Geneva that morning. A last-minute summit with European investors had been on the calendar for months. But instead of boarding the jet, he'd sent his second-in-command and stayed behind. Not because he was needed in New York, but because he couldn't leave without knowing what Jessa truly wanted from him and what he was willing to risk to give it. He checked his watch again. She was late. Not for a meeting. There was no meeting. Just a quiet invitation to his home.
No agenda. No expectations.
Just space. He turned when he heard the elevator hum and the soft chime of its arrival. The doors opened, and she stepped out wearing a soft gray coat and a look that he couldn't quite read. Not guarded. Not open. Something in between. "I've never been here," she said, eyes sweeping across the wide expanse of marble and glass. "I know. Why now?" "Because I don't want there to be parts of me you don't see." She walked slowly into the space, her gaze drifting to the framed sketches along the wall. Not blueprints. Drawings. Of buildings that had never been built. Bridges, mostly. Wide, impossible bridges that seemed to reach into nowhere. "You drew these?" she asked. "I used to think I wanted to be an architect." "What changed?" "My father. He told me bridges don't make money." She studied them for a long time, then turned to him. "You cut them anyway." "They remind me of who I was before I started building things for everyone else." He motioned toward a small room behind the kitchen. She followed. Inside was a nursery. Unused. Unfinished. The walls were painted a muted ivory. A mobile hung from the ceiling, still wrapped in plastic. A single rocking chair sat in the corner. Jessa stood motionless. "I designed this after my brother died," he said quietly. "I thought maybe one day I'd start a family. Something that didn't end the way his did." Her voice was soft. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you're the first person I want to imagine it with." She blinked, expression unreadable. "You don't even know if I want kids. I don't need a guarantee. I just need you to know how much I'm willing to give." He stepped closer, slower this time. "You've cracked every wall I built. You never asked me for anything. And now, all I want is to give you something that matters." Jessa crossed her arms, but it wasn't defensive. It was grounding, like she was trying to steady herself. "Something happened today," she said, "at the shelter."
He stiffened.
"What?" "One of the women found out about the new expansion. She started crying. Not because she was happy, because she didn't believe it would last. She thinks we'll pull the funding. She's seen too many promises broken. Too many men with money who made announcements and disappeared." "I'm not disappearing." "I know. But I watched her hold her baby today, and I realized something." "What?" "I don't want to watch broken things from the sidelines anymore. I want to help fix them." He stepped closer. "Then let's do it together." "I don't want to be your cause, Kieran." "You're not. You're the reason I finally have won." She inhaled deeply, trying to anchor herself. "Then prove it. Not with press. Not with speeches. Show me something real." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. She hesitated before taking it. Her eyes moved down the page, and her breath caught. "You're transferring the foundation under my name?" "I'm not transferring it. I'm stepping back. I'll fund it, but you'll lead it. Set the mission. Build the team. Choose the impact. It's yours. She looked up slowly.
Why?
Because I trust you more than I trust myself. Jess's fingers tightened on the paper. This changes everything. It's supposed to. She stared at him for a long time. Then, slowly, she reached up and touched his face. Not with longing. With something deeper. Like she was touching something fragile that might disappear if she wasn't careful. He leaned into her hand. I don't want to be afraid of loving you, she said. Then let me be the one who makes you feel safe. Her hand dropped. My sister's staying with me for a while. With the baby coming, I'll be helping more. I'll be there too. However you need me. She shook her head. Don't say that unless you mean it. I mean every word. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the glass slightly. But inside, everything felt still. He stepped back and led her to a small room off the hallway. A door she hadn't noticed earlier. He opened it. Inside was a sunroom. Plants lined the windows. A piano sat in the corner, untouched. And in the center, a table with 2 chairs and a chessboard mid-game. My mother taught me to play here, he said. The last time she smiled was in this room. Jessa stepped inside and ran her fingers along the piano's edge. Do you play? Not well. Then let's make a new memory here. She sat at the piano and began to play. Softly. Slowly. A melody he didn't recognize but felt like something he'd heard in a dream once. He sat beside her. Neither of them spoke.
They didn't need to.
The next morning, everything moved fast. Mara was placed on modified bed rest. Jessa adjusted her work schedule. Kieran restructured 2 departments at Calloway Capital to free time for the foundation's launch. But even in the chaos, they stayed tethered. Not by words, by presence. One afternoon, Kieran stepped into the foundation's temporary office and found Jessa surrounded by volunteers, organizing care packages and running intake protocols. She didn't notice him at first. She was laughing with a young woman who had just found transitional housing. The sound of her laugh made his chest ache. He waited until the woman left, then approached. You fit here, he said. I feel like I can breathe here. Then this is where I want to build with you. She turned to him. I've been thinking about something. Something big. Tell me. I want to create a scholarship program for kids who come out of these shelters. Full tuition, mentorship, counseling. Done. I haven't even pitched it properly. You don't need to. She paused. You're not doing this for me, are you? I'm doing it because you helped me remember what it feels like to build something that matters. She looked at him for a long moment. You really meant it. Every word. I've never been more sure of anything. That night, they stood on the rooftop of her apartment building. No grand skyline. Just a few scattered lights and the sound of soft traffic below. I never thought I'd fall for someone like you, she admitted. Someone rich. Someone who made me feel seen. He turned to her. And I never thought I'd fall for a waitress with a temper and no patience for my ego. She laughed, and the sound wrapped around him like warmth. I love you, Jessa, he said. Not because I need you, but because I finally understand what love without control looks like. She didn't hesitate. I love you too. He pulled her close. Not urgently, not possessively, just enough to let the moment settle into their bones. Far below them, the city kept moving. But up here, everything was still, because she had broken his pride. And in its place, they were building something that would outlast them both. The wind carried the scent of lilacs across the lawn as Jessa knelt down, brushing her fingers lightly over the soil. The garden behind the new transitional housing center was still raw, just a few raised beds and a line of young saplings, but it was enough. A beginning. She pressed a lavender sprig into the earth, her hands steady, her breath calm. Kieran stood a few feet behind her, jacket slung over one arm, his sleeves rolled up. He watched her quietly, not interrupting. There was something sacred about the way she moved here.
No pretense.
No audience. Just her and the ground. When she stood, brushing her palms off on her jeans, he walked over and handed her a bottle of water. They delivered the benches, he said. They're setting them up near the east wall. She nodded. I asked them to place them under the overhang. Some of the women need a shaded place to sit between sessions. Already done. She gave him a look. You're not supposed to read my mind, you know. I don't. I just read your notes. She smiled, but it faded into something softer. Sometimes I forget how far this has come. He looked out over the property. The building was modest 2 floors, brick with wide windows and a sheltered courtyard, but it was sturdy. Safe. Alive with possibility. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the back playroom. Somewhere inside, a woman was singing quietly while folding donated clothes. You did this, she said. Not just the money. You showed up. And you stayed. I never planned to leave. Jessa turned toward him then, her expression unreadable. I got a call from the board of the local housing coalition. They want me to join. And I said yes. He nodded once, a quiet pride in his chest. She stepped closer. You're not the reason I said yes. I'd be disappointed if I was. I said yes because I finally believe I can lead something without losing myself in it. Kieran reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. You never had to become someone else to lead. You just had to believe your voice belonged in the room. She exhaled, then looked up at him. I want to start something new. Not just for the women. For the children. A trauma-informed preschool. Inside the center. He didn't hesitate. We'll build it. I want it to be a place where no one has to explain why they flinch at loud noises or why they don't like closed doors. He tightened his grip on her hand. Then we'll make sure every door has a window, and every wall is painted in colors that feel like hope. They stayed like that for a moment, surrounded by the hum of something that felt like restoration. The kind that wasn't loud or dramatic, it just lived in the quiet details. Later that evening, they returned to Jessa's apartment. Mara was asleep in the back bedroom, her belly rounding more each day. The baby would be there soon, and everything in the apartment had shifted to make space for it. The crib tucked into the corner. Diapers stacked neatly in the entryway closet. A mobile of tiny woodland animals hung above the changing table. Kieran moved around the kitchen, pulling out ingredients for dinner. He chopped with precision, but his mind was somewhere else. Jessa noticed. What's going on in that head of yours? He wiped his hands on a towel, then leaned against the counter. I made an offer on the building next to the foundation. Her brow lifted. Why? It has enough space for the preschool. And a rooftop garden. She looked at him for a long moment. You're not restless, are you?
No.
I'm finally still. Jessa set her glass down. Then what's this really about? He met her gaze. It's about building a life. Not just a legacy. She stepped toward him. I want that life with you. But not if it means you forget who you are. I don't want who I was, he said. I want this version. The one who wakes up thinking about how to build a swing set instead of a merger. She leaned her forehead against his chest. You're going to be a good father one day. His hands stilled on her back. I've never said that out loud, she whispered. But I see it. In how you show up. In the way you remember things. He rested his chin on her head. I want children. With you. Silence filled the kitchen, warm and thick with something unspoken. Then she pulled back, gently. Come with me. He followed her to the living room. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a sonogram photo Mara's. 2 tiny shapes, one barely larger than the other. Twins, she said. We found out yesterday. His breath caught. She's going to need more help. We'll be there. Together. He nodded, throat tight. A week later, They stood in front of the city council, presenting the preschool proposal. Jessa handled the questions. Kieran led her. He watched her speak with clarity and conviction, her voice calm but unwavering. And when the council voted unanimously in favor, he reached for her hand under the table and held it tight. That night, they returned to the penthouse. The nursery remained untouched, but not forgotten. He opened the door and turned on the light. "I want to finish it," he said. Jessa stepped inside slowly. "We will. When the time is right." He turned to her. "What if that time is now?" She looked at him, eyes wide, heart suddenly racing. He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, with a single diamond set in a band shaped like two hands clasped together. "I don't want to wait anymore," he said. "We've rebuilt everything around us. Now I want to build with you. A marriage, a home, a family. Will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't blink them away. "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she wrapped her arms around him, holding him like the answer to a question she didn't know she'd been asking. They didn't throw a lavish wedding. They stood in the garden behind the housing center, surrounded by women and children whose lives had been quietly restored by their work. Mara held both babies, now healthy and cooing in her arms. The air smelled of fresh earth and rain-soaked lilac. Jessa wore a simple white dress. Kieran Calloway. They exchanged vows that had nothing to do with promises of perfection and everything to do with presence. "I vow to stay when it's messy," she said. "I vow to listen when I want to fix," he replied. "I vow to be your peace," she whispered. "I vow to be your place," he answered. They kissed, not for the cameras, there were none, but for the quiet knowing that this was the beginning of something unshakable. Years passed. The preschool opened. The scholarship fund expanded. The housing center grew into a network. But more than all of that, their home grew. 2 children, a boy with Kieran's eyes and a girl with Jessa's calm, filled the nursery that once stood still. They built a life of slow mornings and loud dinners, of scraped knees and bedtime stories, of board meetings paused for dance recitals, of love that didn't need to prove itself anymore. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Kieran stood on the porch, their daughter asleep against his chest. Jessa stepped out beside him, her hair swept up, her hands still dirt-stained from the garden. He looked at her like he always did, with awe that never dulled. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think I had to build something that would outlast me." "And now?" she asked, brushing a curl from their daughter's cheek. He kissed her temple. "Now I know the only thing that matters is this. You.
Them.
Us." She leaned into him, the night settling around them like a promise kept. And they stayed there, not chasing anything, not proving anything, just holding the life they built like it was the only thing in the world that ever truly belonged to them.